HVAC people!
Earl Nightingale with insight. There is nothing commonplace in the world except the mental attitude of man. Charles Birchfield penned those words, and they were published in the book Peter's Quotations. There's nothing commonplace in the world except the mental attitude of man. The other day, it was late afternoon, I was sitting on our terrace relaxing with a cup of coffee when I noticed the moon. It seemed nearly full and was quite high in the southwestern sky, even though it was a bright, clear day late in the afternoon. As I looked at that strange dead planet that's held in its orbit by Earth's gravity, I wondered and marveled that it shows us only one side. Since the earliest days of astronomy, we have seen just the one side of the moon. The moon has never revolved an inch, apparently. And I realized how amazing that was. How, I wondered, could a body the size of the moon and in orbit around its larger parent not turn? It hangs in a vacuum of space. It moves about the Earth, and it travels with us on our high-speed journey around the wheel of our great galaxy. Yet it doesn't turn, not a centimeter, in 1,000 years. Incredible. And I thought about the universe and the star whose death we recently observed. The star had died in a great flare of light 170 million years ago. It had taken 170 million years, traveling at the speed of light, for the explosion to reach our searching telescopes. I read about the event in the Smithsonian magazine, and the article pointed out that after the explosion, the star would fall back upon itself in such a way and of such density that a teaspoon of matter at the core would weigh 100 million tons. A teaspoon-sized bit of matter, of a density that would cause it to weigh 100 million tons. I tried to imagine something an inch long by a half-inch wide, weighing 100 million tons, all part of our universe. Everywhere we look at nature, our minds are boggled, and when we think in terms of the vastness of the universe, we realize how infinitesimal we human creatures truly are. I read somewhere that there are creatures so small, they live in the intestines of no-see-ums, those tiny flying creatures that can be such an annoyance on a hot day when we're fishing or trying to enjoy a sandwich. That's what we're like, you might say, when compared to the vastness and the wonder of the universe. No, there's nothing commonplace in the world, except the mental attitude of man. Our attitudes are the result of choice. Each of us chooses his or her attitude. In the book of Proverbs we read, "As one thinks in one's heart, so one is." We are what we think in our hearts, which means our deepest thoughts, our habitual way of seeing ourselves, which in turn seems to be based on the feedback we've received from our environment. As a small child, I learned that people can get used to anything. I found people who worked in circuses who were bored and appeared unhappy. I couldn't imagine how anyone could work in a circus and be bored. As a youngster, I used to visit the docks where the freighters tied up. I'd watch the men on those ships and envy them their travels to the far, interesting places of the earth. But they seemed blasé about the whole thing. A human being can grow accustomed to and take for granted the most wonderful and astonishing things. Not just the miraculous world about him, but his work as well, and the people with whom he works and the people with whom he lives. After a while, the glow, the radiance seems to fade, even from the most wonderful and delightful aspects of life. And it all settles down into a kind of vegetable soup. And that's too bad. It should never happen. We should never stop wondering why the moon doesn't rotate the way the Earth does. Thank God it does. Wouldn't it be terrible to have sunshine on only half of the Earth all the time, while the other half would have to live in perpetual darkness? Do you remember the excitement you knew the first day on the job, or how you felt the day you were married, or when the children were born? It's really all much too fabulous ever to take for granted or get used to. Marcus Aurelius, a brilliant, thoughtful emperor of Rome about 2,000 years ago, said, "Every man is worth just so much as the things are worth about which he busies himself." A very powerful and revealing statement, that. Every man is worth just so much as the things are worth about which he busies himself. And that's about it. And once in a while it's good to take a look at what we're doing and what we're noticing, what catches and holds our interest. Are we conscious of the miracle that consists of our living here on this small blue planet? Do we find awe and inspiration from the mystery that surrounds us during our personal holiday on Earth? If we think about it, the sameness of our lives will vanish, the ordinary will be a thing of the past, and we'll begin to notice and enjoy life again. I came across a great statement the other morning, the sort of thing that makes you sit and think for a few minutes. It goes like this. Institutions, like vineyards, should be judged by the quality of their vintages. The man who said that was Crawford H. Greenwald, former president and now a director of the DuPont Company. It's worth thinking about, isn't it? Institutions, like vineyards, should be judged by the quality of their vintages. You can apply this to a commercial enterprise of any kind, or a school, a college, a university, a church, a farm, a family, or a country. I, for one, would rather be connected with a small organization turning out a really great product than with the largest organization in the world turning out products of an ordinary nature. But quality has nothing to do with size. Some of the largest institutions have the best reputations for quality. In fact, many of them grew large because of their insistence on quality. There are very few things as important to instill in ourselves and our children as the love of quality for quality's sake. We automatically look for this virtue in others and admire it when we find it. We want it in the people who build our home and in every service we receive. We want it in the education of our kids, in the kind of medical and dental attention we receive, in the food we eat, in the car we drive, in the clothes we wear, in the books and newspapers we read, and in the entertainment we seek. We enjoy watching a professional golf tournament or basketball or football or baseball game, a fine athletic event of any sort, because we enjoy watching professionals. We enjoy the quality of their performances. Quality puts value on everything or anything. And because we admire it so much in others, and look for it in those we love and with whom we associate, and look for it in all the products and services we pay for, we should most certainly demand it of ourselves in everything we do, because it's what gives us quality, too. Before we turn loose of anything to which we've set our hand and mind, we should ask ourselves, is this up to my standards of quality? And because quality of any sort is a journey more than a destination, we should also ask ourselves, how can I improve on the quality of what I do? There are no unimportant jobs. There isn't a job of any sort on which the stamp of quality won't make the person doing that job great. In raising children, cooking meals, cleaning a house, or manufacturing a child's toy or an automobile or a screw or a nail or a nuclear power plant. Quality is one commodity of which we never tire, which we always need. It's something we will never fail to admire, and it puts upon people and institutions the stamp of greatness, and it's something you can never fake. Time exposes the lack of quality like the geological strata of a canyon, and people almost instinctively know and respect quality when they find it, or turn away when they do not. I think it was Goethe who said, wood burns because it has the proper stuff in it, and a man becomes great because he has the proper stuff in him. I think that the most fortunate adults are those who are living well today but who knew a deprived childhood. It's also true, I think, that the most creative people are those who had a rough time as kids. Children raised in poverty, or if not poverty, at least on the wrong side of the tracks, must fall back on their imagination for enjoyment. Their lives are filled with daydreams. Their imaginations become wonderfully active. In an instant, their bleak surroundings can vanish, and in the warm, sunny world of their minds, all sorts of wonderful things can happen to them. It's been my experience that adults who have been very well off all their lives tend to be less interesting than those who knew a certain amount of privation as youngsters. They also seem to be a little more bored with life, less happy than those who now find great interest in having things they didn't have as children. Now, we all want our kids to have the things we didn't have as youngsters, I suppose, but I think it's more for our enjoyment than theirs. Kids really couldn't care less. It seems that all a child needs for good, healthy growth, assuming an adequate diet, is love in the family. If that's there, nothing else seems to matter much. During World War II, it was decided to remove many thousands of small children from war-ravaged London to protect them from the bombing. It was soon discovered that removing them from their families and homes was much worse for them than the risks of bombing. Studies of highly creative people more often than not turn up the fact that they were forced to live in their imaginations as children, and so took highly developed imaginations into adulthood. It's also true that the poor kid develops into more of a risk-taker than the rich kid. It may be because he simply has less to lose, but it's also a fact that the better off a family becomes, the more conservative it tends to become, the less chances it's willing to take. Eric Hoffer was right when he said there's a conservatism of the very poor that's as rigid as the conservatism of the very rich, which is an interesting subject, incidentally. But out of 100 people, There will be one or two who are sufficiently discontented with things, as they are, to do something about it. And the poor kid will take bigger risks than the rich kid. There's a good and bad to everything. Poverty gives to a person almost complete freedom or time, but he lacks the money to do the things he wants to do. A lot of money, on the other hand, diminishes freedom or time. Even with the money to do the things he could not do as a poor youngster, his responsibilities now restrict him in other ways as rigidly as before. The president of a great corporation died. When they went through his desk in his massive, plush-paneled office to clean out his things, they found an old fishing line with a bobber and rusty hook wrapped around a stick. Somehow he hadn't done enough of it. With the top job in the company, the clubs and civic things, the professional associations, the crises on the job and at home, he hadn't had the time to just go sit on a bank and fish for a while. Under almost all conditions, there's a world to be enjoyed, but the most fortunate people seem to be those who knew a certain amount of privation as youngsters. Here's a real shocker for you. One psychiatrist has estimated that as high as 90% of all marriages are endured but not particularly enjoyed. That's the sort of indictment which, if true, could cause a person to turn in his membership card in the human race. Even if that psychiatrist is 50% correct, it's a heck of a thing to contemplate. But do you know the reason for the negative reaction on the part of so many people toward the highly touted bliss of matrimony? Take a guess. What's causing this dismaying lack of enthusiasm on the part of married couples? The answer is that in about 90% of marriages, the interest has gone out of them. They've been permitted to grind to a boring halt in the interest department. We have contests and conventions for salespeople and business people. Professional people have their associations and a constant inflow of new material on interesting improvements or breakthroughs. Working people have baseball or bowling teams and various other kinds of interesting get-togethers. But what of marriage? What do the average married people do to constantly inject new interest and excitement into their marriages? According to the records, they do very little or nothing about it at all. Let me tell you what one extremely successful married couple I know does to keep charm and interest in their marriage. Each of them tries to think of ways in which he or she can demonstrate to the other his or her value as a partner in marriage. Hardly a week goes by without one or the other sending a card, usually a funny card, to the other. He travels quite a bit, and he sends her cards from airports all over the country. At the beginning of the year, each of them marks off important days on the calendar, days they don't want to forget, birthdays, anniversaries, and other special occasions. These days never pass without some kind of remembrance. They especially celebrate the anniversary of the day they met, and they have parties on the children's birthdays. They plan trips for weeks in advance, which gives each of them something to look forward to. Several times each year they go to a nearby resort for a weekend and play golf together, and just generally change the setting of their marriage. From time to time, each of them gives the other a prize for being a good wife or husband. They think of little, sort of inexpensive things to do for each other. They know that unless they work at making their marriage successful and interesting, it will slowly become dull and average. They've made a career of having a happy, interesting marriage, and their marriage is as interesting now, 20 years later, as it was the first year. They believe, as I do, that life is dull only to dull people. They don't want to be dull people, and they're not. Their marriage is high in the successful 10%. How about yours? What have you done lately to let your partner know how much you appreciate him or her? If you find that, the interest has largely disappeared from your marriage, remember that with very little effort on your part, it can be restored. You don't have to talk about it. Just start doing something about it. Lewis Mumford, the social critic, says that the great saints of the last century were as often as not artists, like Van Gogh or the great American painter Ryder or Tolstoy. As was pointed out so well in the publication Manus, Van Gogh was late in becoming an artist. He began at the age of 27, and his enormous output, 840 paintings and 850 drawings and watercolors, were all done during the last 10 years of his life. He was always desperately poor. Only one painting was sold during his entire lifetime. He sold that one to his brother, and he had no exhibitions. Blows, disappointments, and discouragements followed him everywhere. Yet he painted furiously until the end, doing 70 paintings and more than 30 drawings in the last 70 days of his life. His name was virtually unknown when he died. Today, Van Gogh is generally considered the greatest Dutch painter after Rembrandt. In 1883 he wrote, "In my opinion, I'm often very rich. Not in money, but rich because I have found my vocation. Something for which I can live with heart and soul, and which gives life inspiration and meaning." Van Gogh's work was the distillation of the life of a man who was both driven and led to do what he had to do. He said, "To be a link in the chain of artists, we pay a heavy toll in health, youth, and freedom, and we benefit not at all by it, no more than does a horse drawing a coachload of people who are out to enjoy the spring." Albert Ryder was born 6 years earlier than Van Gogh in 1847 and lived as a recluse in New York City. He cooked on an open grate on a small stove, saw only a few friends, and slept on a piece of carpet on the floor. When the famous art critic, Carl Hartman, who could have made Ryder famous overnight, called and stuck his card in the locked door and then returned later, he found a laconic note from Ryder saying, "I always spend my time looking at the sky at this season of the year." Ryder's brother, who owned a small hotel, found him half-starved in a furnished room and brought him back to the hotel to take care of him. Ryder, to his brother's irritation, fraternized with the servants, and when a waiter with whom he became friendly killed himself after losing all his money on a wild bet at the racetrack, Ryder painted the racetrack, perhaps his best-known work. Of the painter, Ryder said, "The artist must buckle himself with infinite patience. His ears must be deaf to the clamor of insistent friends who would quicken his pace. His eyes must see naught but the vision beyond. He must await the season of fruitage without haste, without worldly ambitions, without vexation of spirit. An inspiration is no more than a seed that must be planted and nourished. The canvas I began 10 years ago I shall perhaps complete today or tomorrow. It's been ripening under the sunlight of the years that come and go. It's a wise artist who knows when to cry halt in his composition, but it should be pondered over in his heart and worked out with prayer and fasting." So these people have much to teach everyone, not merely about art, but about life and work in the real world. That's what Lewis Mumford means. And when we study the lives of such people, it makes us take a new look at our work. The other day, some friends and I were talking about man's faults and his propensity for getting into trouble of one kind or another. We finally agreed that what gets most people into trouble, the agency that has caused more trouble, pain, bloodshed, and grief in the world, is man's ability to speak, to open his big mouth and put his foot into it. Too often, I think, we forget the importance of silence. Far more sales have been lost by having said too much than by having said too little. I heard a speech in New York City one time in which the speaker said, "The Bible tells us that Samson slew 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. And every day, all over the country, 50,000 sailors are killed with the same weapon." An excellent command of the English language is vital to the really successful salesperson, but he also knows when to turn it off, when to listen, when to simply sit and nod and look interested in what his prospect is saying, and to perhaps interject a word here and there calculated to keep the ball rolling. In my books of quotations, the wisdom of silence is given a lot of space. It seems that most writers, thinkers, and philosophers agreed that knowing when to keep silent is one of man's highest and most difficult achievements. In fact, of all the virtues, Zeno chose silence, for by it, he said, "I hear other men's imperfections and conceal my own." F.W. Robertson said, "A silent man is easily reputed wise." It's amazing but true that a person will advance farther faster by sharply limiting what he has to say than by trying to show how much he knows by talking too much. And Bulwer said, "The main reason why silence is so efficacious an element of repute is, first, because of the magnification which proverbially belongs to the unknown, and secondly, because silence provokes no man's envy and wounds no man's self-love." Makes sense, doesn't it? Most of the embarrassing moments we can remember and the pain we've inflicted on others and ourselves have come about because we didn't have enough sense or self-control to merely keep silent instead of speaking. How often is silence the wisest of replies? And it's been written that well-timed silence hath more eloquence than speech. And a silent man's words are not brought into court, and a slip of the foot may soon be recovered, but that of the tongue, perhaps never. And again, he that can rule his tongue shall live without strife, and if you don't say it, you'll never have to unsay it. Refusing to be embroiled in an argument is the way to win it every time. We're noisiest when we're little children. Gradually, as we grow into maturity, our sound should lessen in both definitions of the word volume. Here's another. Nature has given us 2 ears, 2 eyes, and but 1 tongue, to the end that we should hear and see more than we speak. And another important point. Neither speak well nor ill of yourself. If well, men will not believe you. If ill, they'll believe a great deal more than you say. And talking comes by nature, silence by wisdom. Of course, I'm a fine one to be talking about the wisdom of silence. It's also been written that he who would close another man's mouth should first tie his own. So with that, in one of Sidney J. Harris's columns, I read that an advertising copywriter was fired from his job for dozing at his desk during work hours. And he went on to comment that he couldn't sympathize with his plight, for if he had really been adept in the art of salesmanship, he surely could have persuaded his boss that he was not dozing, but was in a creative trance. I remember a case during World War II when a tired guardhouse sentry who had little imagination lay down for a snooze with his head against the wall of the guardhouse. When he was discovered by the watch officer, he was ready. The watch officer kicked his foot and yelled something, and the sentry immediately held up his hand and said, "Shh, I think I hear them digging out." In the column, Sid Harris went on to point out that Coleridge would fall asleep while working at his desk. On awakening, he would find that he had composed 200 or 300 lines of excellent verse. He wrote his immortal Kubla Khan in such a trance. And such varied men of genius as Descartes, Leibniz, Milton, and Rossini used to stimulate their creative juices by lying down under piles of blankets to meditate. Schopenhauer once remarked that my will is asleep when I do my most effective thinking, which is usually in a semi-trance. And Carlyle, in praising slumber, said, the unconscious is the maker of creative power, the conscious that of mere skill. Sir Walter Scott, that prolific novelist, would often retire at night, having vainly sought an idea for hours, and the idea would promptly greet him the next morning upon arising. I've had that happen. Likewise, Pascal used to lay paper and pencil at his bedside. On many nights he would awaken and start scribbling his famous Pensées. Tartini, the Italian musician, composed his Devil's Trill Sonata while asleep, and some of Schubert's sweetest melodies came to him in dreams. Voltaire one night dreamed an entire canto of his epic poem, La Henriade, in an entirely different and improved version from the one he had written the preceding day. Condorcet, the brilliant French mathematician, had the same fruitful experience with mathematical formula. Diogenes Laertius, the Greek historian, mentions a Stoic philosopher who composed and corrected philosophical treatises while he was sleepwalking. But why go on? That copywriter deserved to be fired not for dozing at his desk, but for failing to impress upon his superiors the ancient, noble, and highly creative precedents he was following. How could he sell toothpaste or detergents if he couldn't sell his own working habits? It was a very good column, and very true. If you're a structural steelworker, dozing can be fatal. But if you're in a creative pursuit, if your stock in trade is ideas, learning to use the power of your unconscious is the key to success. We can be skillful with the conscious mind, but for genius, we need the unconscious. Sigmund Freud, credited with the discovery of the unconscious, said that the conscious mind is like a fountain playing in the sun, while down below is the great ocean of the unconscious. You can learn to use your unconscious or subconscious mind first by realizing you have one, and that it's incredibly capable, and second, by posing questions to it just before meditating, dozing, or sleeping. Here's something worth keeping in mind. If one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. It was written by Henry Thoreau, and it contains a truth most people do not even dream exists. If they did, the whole country might be turned into total chaos. The truth most of us miss in that great quotation is that success, beyond anything we might now imagine, lies in wait for those who can put together enough courage to actually live the life they imagine. You know, most people live in 2 worlds. There's the real world, the world in which they work and move and live, the world of the nitty-gritty, and there's the world of the imagination, the world they would secretly like to live in. What keeps them from moving from the world of reality into the world of their imagination is habit, and the fear of falling flat on their face in the attempt, and losing even the little which they presently have, and perhaps looking ridiculous in the eyes of their loved ones and friends. They are the Walter Mitties of the world, and we're all Walter Mitties to some extent. What we fail to realize is what Thoreau discovered, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams, and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Thoreau knew this because he did it. So did Gauguin, the painter. So have thousands of others who have found to their delighted surprise that life pays off most handsomely when we're doing that which we most want to do, when we're actually living the life we have imagined for so long. It certainly doesn't mean that we run off after every vagrant whim, but it does mean that we should live the life that we know deep down in our very being that we would most like to live. It means that we should be doing that which every indicator of our makeup, every fiber of our being tells us we should be doing, and has been telling us for some time. Gauguin didn't tear off for Tahiti the first time the delightful thought popped into his strange head, nor did Thoreau go to live at Walden Pond the first time the idea struck him to go off by himself and meditate and think and write and try to discover for himself what was important and what wasn't. But when an idea tugs at us day after day, year after year, when we think about it as we lie awake in bed or the first thing when we wake up or every time there's a lull in our days, when it worries our consciousness like a puppy with a slipper, then it's time to do something about it. And even though making the move might seem to jeopardize everything of order in our lives, it is very likely, as Thoreau suggested, that we will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. The most commonly voiced thought after taking such a step is, "Why didn't I do this years ago?" And here's another good quote from Forbes magazine. "One of the chief objects of education should be to widen the windows through which we view the world." It's by Arnold Glasow. How wide are your windows?